The Society for Vascular Surgery, under the leadership of Richard Cambria and Peter Glavitsky, has initiated audiovisual interviews with pioneers of vascular surgery. This is part of an effort by SVS to develop archives to preserve the history of SVS as well as vascular surgery as a specialty. A committee was formed called the History Project Work Group, chaired by Jimmy Yao, with Norm Rich and me as members. Cal Ernst served as our consultant. Because of the workload, an expansion of the committee was undertaken to include William Baker, Mark Eskandari, Walt McCarthy, Bill Pierce, Melina Kibbe, and Peter Lawrence, as well as Ken Cherry. Since the program initiated in November of 2011, over 50 interviews have been conducted. My name is Roger Gregory, and today, in conjunction with Walt McCarthy and Jimmy Yao, we will interview the legendary surgeon, Dr. John Mannick. I've always seen Dr. Mannick as the Clark Kent of vascular surgery. While Dr. Mannick gives the appearance of being the mild-mannered academic surgeon and complete scholar, he is also fiercely competitive and never seems to hesitate to voice his opinion. Thank you, John, for agreeing to this interview.
My pleasure.
Let's start in your early days. You were described as being raised in a rugged, rural environment. This was in South Dakota?
No, I grew up in the town of Yakima, Washington, actually.
But you were born in South Dakota?
I was, but I left there at age 2 weeks, perhaps sensing something about the environment.
Now, you were the only child.
True.
Of your mom and dad. Your dad was a civil engineer?
He was, and he ended up designing irrigation projects, which is why we ended up where we did. Yakima is east of the mountains in the state of Washington and is in the middle of an irrigated valley and a very lush farming area. So it was basically a small farming city that I grew up in, about 30,000 people.
And your mom?
She was a school teacher, and she didn't teach when I was very young, but she did teach when I was a little older, particularly when I was in high school.
Were they influential at this particular point in your life, John, as far as your later development?
I would suppose one's parents are always principally influential on your life, and mine were no exception. So I certainly owe them a great debt, but it was a very pleasant rural environment, and I have very pleasant recollections of it.
And you went to grammar school in public school?
All the way through public school until I went to college.
Now, you were described in high school as being an indifferent athlete. How can that be?
Well, I would say that I was on the tennis team, but I was playing second singles and first doubles, so I wasn't the star. You
were also described, John, as being somewhat of a geek at that time. Is that true? Would you look back?
I didn't understand what that word was.
Well, you were moving towards being an intellectual, perhaps.
Well, I think I thought myself an intellectual of sorts anyway.
Well, you ended up as class valedictorian.
That's, I think, indicates where my goal was, yes.
What exactly were you thinking about doing at that point in your life, John?
Well, I had a lot of things that I wanted to do. I think most of my life I thought that I would end up going into engineering as my father had, but I wanted to be an aeronautical engineer, and I had the idea that I'd like to join the Air Force for a while and get some practical experience, and then try to get involved in designing aircraft for one of the bigger companies. But somewhere along the line in high school, I decided probably that medicine would be what I'd like to pursue, and I can't give you any kind of Pauline moment or anything that happened to me. The heavens didn't open, no voices came down from the clouds. I just decided maybe I'd like to be a doctor. I don't know why exactly. I certainly had no doctors in the family.
There are branch points in everyone's life, and I would have to think the first branch point in your life was college.
Oh, it was. I had done, as you say, quite well academically in high school, and so I was looking for scholarships to good institutions, and where I really wanted to go to school was Stanford.
Right.
I'd been down there, and I thought if you died and went to heaven, it'd look just like Palo Alto. So I really wanted to go to Stanford. And when I graduated, I was given, after a small sojourn in the armed forces of a few weeks as the war was ending, World War II was ending, I found that Stanford would offer me a half scholarship, which seemed pretty good to me, though not so great to my parents. And Harvard decided to embark on a regional distribution program, as they called it. And I'm quite secure that they never had anybody at Harvard from Yakima, Washington before, and I found waiting for me a offer of full board room and tuition for 4 years.
Wow.
And after 30 seconds reflection on my parents' part, I was on the train to Boston in the early fall of 1945.
And this was a little bit of a culture shock for young John Mannick.
Oh my gosh, you can imagine who was cultured and who was shocked. I thought Boston was the dumpiest looking old place I ever saw, and Harvard was even worse. And I wondered, how could I have left that beautiful countryside around Palo Alto for this? But it was all economics, I guess, because it was bought and paid for. And I pretty soon found that I liked it at Harvard. I don't know exactly why, but it grew on me, and I liked my classmates. I liked the instructors. I even liked the old campus after a few months.
Well, you were suddenly surrounded by other bright lights.
Well, I think that's probably true of everybody who suddenly gets out of high school and goes to college, and Harvard was certainly no change from that. So I definitely found that there were an awful lot of bright people around, and fortunately for me, a lot of them had just come back from World War II. So I went to school with a lot of veterans, and the first group that came back were the ones that had the highest number of discharge points, which meant they'd had the most dangerous jobs in the service. And a few people like me who'd either been in too little a time to count. You had to be in at least 3 months for the service time to be counted at all, and I was in about 6 weeks. But I ended up with one roommate who'd been a Marine fighter pilot with 235 combat missions, and another who'd been a captain in the 101st Airborne who had been caught in that bridge too far affair and lost most of his platoon when he was a second lieutenant. So they were definitely more mature individuals to go to school with. So I think we were very fortunate that those people were around when us kids, as they called us, were starting college.
Now, you ended up majoring in English, history, and literature.
Correct.
And yet went to medical school. Somehow that doesn't seem to fit.
Well, in those days, I think it did, in that I think the idea was in minds of a lot of people in medical school admissions committees, whether it would be nice to have medical students who were well-rounded in an education before they took up something like a profession. So I took the requisite science courses and majored in the humanities. I never regretted that, honestly.
So this was a good time for you at Harvard.
Oh, I had a wonderful time.
Undergraduate.
Yeah.
But when you went to medical school at Harvard, this is a little different.
Well, it's true. I thought medical school was a letdown after college, which I thought was stimulating. Medical school I thought was fairly boring most of the time. It was rote memorization and
a lot of it.
A lot of it, and I thought it was pretty dull. So I was not a particularly happy first and second year student. I liked some of the courses quite a bit, but some I really didn't like much at all. I had a very mediocre performance in medical school.
What did you like about medical school best? What was the
well, you know,
most
when I
attractive
went to
part of it?
medical school, I really thought that what I wanted to be was a psychiatrist. and therefore the humanities background seemed very appropriate for that. I then had a few experiences with psychiatry and the patients they were dealing with, and it was clear to me that I had made a terrible misjudgment about what my career was to be. And I tried to think if there was anything that I really liked in medical school a whole lot. And the thing that I liked best was dog surgery. And so I thought, well, you know, maybe what I'm cut out for is something totally different. Maybe I ought to think about surgery. And so I took some surgical electives and applied for internship and residency in surgery.
Well, one highlight of medical school was you got married.
We definitely met. Jenny and I were classmates in college. She was at Radcliffe and I was at Harvard. It was both, they now call it all Harvard, but we found this a very nice arrangement. I think the girls thought it was nicer. There were about 850 of them and 5,000 men. But, I remember her from some of our chemistry classes. That was her major. And then we started dating when we were in graduate school. I was a medical student. She was a graduate student, both at Harvard Medical School.
Yeah. In 1954, once again, you were in the military.
Yeah, this was when my when the chips came due from not having been in World War II and the Korean War was on. They found another war for us who hadn't been in the first one, and so everybody who in my class who hadn't been in World War II was in the Korean War.
Was this wasted time, John, or good time, or?
Well, I think from the perspective of medical things, it was probably a wasted time. I actually had quite a good time because, as I think I mentioned over lunch, some of my colleagues had told our chief at MGH that they'd like academic careers and were placed in laboratories. And I had told him that that was the last thing I wanted to do because I really liked operating. And so I found myself in flight surgeon school. And I actually enjoyed that. At the base I was stationed at in California, I didn't ever get to Korea. The flight surgeons were encouraged to learn how to fly, so they taught me how to fly, and you couldn't fly by yourself, but you was allowed to do most of the time I spent in airplanes, which was requisite. You had to have a certain amount of flying time in order to get paid, and you got paid nearly double if you were on flying status, which didn't bother my wife and me at all. So I flew quite a lot, and I enjoyed it. And there were some pretty good airplanes coming into the operational status in those days, such as our first jet airplanes. And that was pretty cool, I thought, to be able to fly a jet trainer around and about. Mac Perry had the same experience at the same time. He stayed a pilot all his life.
Right.
Virginia had a little talk with me when we left the Air Force, and I never got in the cockpit of an airplane since.
Now, you went then to a surgery residency at Mass General.
Yes.
What was that like, John, and who was the chief at that time?
Our chief was Dr. Edward Churchill, who was a pioneer thoracic surgeon. I never knew him very well because my internship started when Dr. Churchill had had a stroke, and Dr. Mike DeBakey came in because he had worked with Churchill in the war. He had worked under him. He admired him so much that he dropped his departmental duties in Houston and came up for the better part of 6 months as the interim chief at the MGH. So I actually started my internship with Mike DeBakey as my chief. And oddly enough, Stanley Crawford is my first chief resident. So there were some fairly clinically active people in charge when I began my training.
Now, you finished in 1960 after doing an extra year of laboratory work with E. Donald Thomas.
Correct. Well, in the Air Force, and perhaps to some degree to the influence of my wife, had decided that probably I would like to contribute something in the way of research as well as clinical care when I got out of residency. So I proposed working in the not yet clinically developed field of transplantation. And where I wanted to go was to work with a young man named Don Thomas, who was doing bone marrow transplants in dogs up in Cooperstown, New York, which was an affiliate of Columbia Presbyterian. He had been trained at the Brigham as a hematologist and was beginning to experiment with bone marrow transplants in humans, and certainly did the preliminary work in large animals, dogs. And that appealed to me because the goal in a lot of surgeons' minds was to be able to sew organs into tolerant human beings. And you could make an animal tolerant, at least a mouse tolerant, by putting in another mouse's bone marrow, and then that bone marrow recipient would be tolerant of the graft from the bone marrow donor. So clearly it seemed that if you're going to sew an organ graft in as opposed to a skin graft, which was all that anybody could do in mice in those days, a dog might be a great way to start. And so I went up there with the idea that it might be possible to do a organ transplant in a dog that had foreign bone marrow, and take the kidney, which is what we were thinking of transplanting, from the bone marrow donor and put it into the bone marrow recipient and see what happened. In other words, it was an attempt at proof of principle. So I thought that would be a great thing to do, and got to the lab, and we ended up, in fact, getting that done during my time with Don Thomas. So I was very pleased, and I think he was too.
So after that year wound up, what did you want to do then?
Well, I wanted to go back to residency. I did, but going up to work with Don Thomas had not been popular with the residency directors at the MGH, who felt that was not a laboratory that was worthy of an MGH resident. I must say I came away from there thinking that it had been the most wonderful year I'd spent in a long, long time. And so I was of a different opinion, but nobody at the MGH ever asked me what I did that year. So I finished my residency with no available employment on the local scene, and I was very pleased when I heard from Dr. David Hume by telephone, who, along with his partner, Dr. Richard Egdahl, had apparently read some of the papers that I'd written from the work I'd done with Don Thomas, and they thought perhaps I might fit into their Department of Surgery down at Medical College of Virginia, where we met, Roger.
Yes, it was.
So I went down there to talk to both of them, and came back and talked to Ginny, and we decided that we would go there for sure, mostly, I think, because it was the only job I had that was academic, and secondly, because I thought there was a great pair to be associated with.
Yeah.
And that they certainly knew how to do the academic surgical game and could probably teach me as well. So I went down there with considerable enthusiasm.
Well, this had to be the second branch point in your career.
There's no question about it.
Now, also by 1964, you had moved to be assistant professor. What was that time like, John? You had a brilliant surrounding cast, not only Dr. Hume, Dr. Egdahl, but also Mel Williams, who was
Of course, he wasn't back yet from Australia.
Right. He was doing
so
immunology there.
He took my place, actually. So I knew Mel because we were residents together.
And George Prout in GU,
Yeah,
Bill Collins in neurosurgery,
outstanding.
Dick Lauer in
Of course, he arrived
Cardiac.
again after I left, but he just was arriving as I was
Right.
leaving.
Dr. Zimberg at the VA. This
Wonderful
was just
guy.
a terrific
No,
cast.
we had a good time down there, no question about it. I left because Dick Egdahl got offered the chairmanship at Boston University, and it seemed to me that getting back to Boston about that time wouldn't be at all a bad thing, because at that time in Richmond, as you recall, that new cast of characters at MCV was not very popular with the local gentry.
No.
So we thought it might be nice to go back to somewhere where they might like us a little bit. So Jenny and I were quite happy to pack up and get out of there, and didn't have to worry about who we were drawing on next, So it was, I think, just a not particularly good time at MCV for the new group.
When you left MCV to go with Dr. Egdahl, you went then to Boston University,
Indeed.
and in less than 10 years, you were surgical chairman.
Yes, I guess we could say that they either were hard up or were fast moving, one or the other. And
This would have to be your third branch point,
yes, it was.
and at that point, clearly you were an independent force.
Well, I certainly think that, vascular surgery was my game by that time. I think it started out by being an interest in everybody in Dave Hume's inner circle.
Right.
But I always tell this story and nobody believes it, but it was really true, since he had two major interests in surgery. One of them was endocrine surgery, the other was vascular surgery, with the idea that the vascular surgery moved right into transplantation, which it certainly does from a technical point of view. So he wanted one of us, his two senior assistants, to take up one as a special interest and the other to take up the other. So we all three talked quite a bit, and both Egdahl and I told him that we both like all these things. So he flipped a coin, and I don't know whether he flipped the coin purposely or whether it was indeed pure chance, but Egdahl ended up with endocrinology and I ended up with vascular.
In 1976, you moved NAM from Boston University back to Peterbilt Brigham.
Yes, I'd never been there before. I point out this was the first time I'd ever had anything to do with the Brigham. The MGH and the Brigham, as you know, didn't really get along terribly well over the years.
Not at all.
Though most of the Brigham chiefs had been trained at the MGH, it turned out. But in any case, I got offered that job. I really thought where I was going in 1976 was to UCLA, where I had been offered the job to succeed Bill Longmire as chief of surgery. And I thought that was a terrific opportunity.
Was.
And obviously what happens when you have this sort of debutante season in academic surgery is that if somebody wants you, then everybody wants you. So suddenly I heard from Gene Brownwald that they'd like me to take the Brigham job. I had interviewed there 6 months earlier and hadn't heard a word from anybody, and I thought they were absolutely disinterested in me, but that was a definite job offer, so Ginny and I didn't know what to do. We went down to the Caribbean for a week to just lie in the sun and talk about things, and we decided probably it would be just as much fun if we stayed in Boston and went back to our old original institution. So we decided that. Every winter I wonder whether it wasn't the wrong decision, but it was the one we made.
Why had you decided to leave Boston University? What was it?
Oh, well, I found that it was all very pleasant in its way, but it didn't seem to me it was ever going to be a absolutely top drawer institution. I don't mean it was bad, but I didn't think it was top drawer, and there was always that monster Harvard hanging over your shoulder, and it's sort of annoying. And the final thing that did it, to be perfectly frank, was that Dr. Smithwick, who had been BU's famous chief preceding Dick Egdahl, had left an endowment for the Department of Surgery. So the chief actually had a slush fund of something in the neighborhood of $12 million.
Wow.
That was very nice. Well, what I found was by the time I was chief of surgery, Dick Egdahl was medical center director, And my best friend from college days, who was a lawyer and a financial person, was the chairman of the board of trustees. And those guys decided to use the $12 million to help build a building for the Department of Medicine. And I thought, you know, if your two best friends in this business will do that to you, maybe the answer is that it's time to get out and try to set some new ground rules. And so I started looking at other chairmanships, and so I finally ended up at the Brigham, which I must say I was told would be a terrible thing for me to do. The idea of succeeding Franny Moore, you're out of your mind, you know, he'll eat you alive, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing could have been further from the truth. He was absolutely perfectly behaved at all times. He became a very good friend of mine, and
Wow.
I enjoyed his company. And so all of that was totally wrong. And I guess the answer really is that I've enjoyed my time at the Brigham thoroughly.
You were now doing only vascular surgery and had become the Mosley professor.
Yes.
And I'd have to say, the rest after that is history. With
Yes.
what's happened to John Mannick. In 1994, you retired, but stayed as an investigator.
Yes, that's true. I figured that when I stopped being the surgeon-in-chief, I probably ought to stop operating and get out of the way. And I had always kept a research interest during all those preceding years, and had some research funding that was still ongoing, and I figured it'd be very pleasant to just go ahead and do research for a while. And
In fact,
that's
let
what
me
I did.
interrupt for a moment. In fact, your funding took you all the way to age 80.
Yes, that's true.
So you never lacked for funding in research,
No, not really.
which is an enormous accomplishment.
Well, you know, I think there are probably others who do it. I think I was just a little more persistent. But any rate, I did what I wanted to do, and I thought I was staying out of the way. And I don't think the old chiefs should bedevil new chiefs if you can possibly avoid doing so. But I think my time at the Brigham was mostly one of enormous growth. You know, we had this little boutique hospital when I
Right.
got there. And in fact, Braunwald, who knew his psychology very well, knew that I probably would not take the job unless there was evidence that the new hospital, which had been talked about and talked about and talked about, was actually under
Happened.
construction. So he persuaded the administration and the board to dig a big hole for the foundation of the new hospital, even though they hadn't got anything together to put in it. So I arrived there with this big hole there, which lasted for a couple of years, which was christened Lake Mannick. You know, and they finally built a hospital there, and then we suddenly had a big hospital as opposed to a little hospital. And my job was to try to fill that surgical vacuum with a big department of surgery. So my job was mostly recruiting, I think, as a surgical chairman. We had a department of 20 full-time members when I got there, and 62 when I left after 18 years. So it was a big recruiting bonanza.
And a few more operating rooms.
Oh yeah, we were doing about 8,000 cases a year when I arrived, and 28,000 when I left. So it was a big
Real progress.
step upward in terms of volume all around.
Now, when you went, it's interesting to me, or confusing to me, that your research focus had nothing to do with vascular surgery. It was immune consequences of injury.
Well, the reason I got on that, Roger, was simply that I'd been a transplant surgeon and transplant investigator before I got to the Brigham. I was doing transplants and vascular surgery at BU. And it just occurred to me that taking on this responsibility for building a totally new department and everything else that I was trying to do, that trying to do two different clinical things might be too much. And looking around at the Brigham, it seemed to me they didn't need any more help in kidney transplantation, which is the only thing we were transplanting then. And I thought they might need some help in vascular surgery, so I decided to just focus on that. And my research was in transplant immunology, but you know, that is really the same immune system that we were talking about being compromised in severe injury. So it was a natural move in the lab. Though I've got to say that from a perspective of your career and what people think about you, it was a nightmare. And that the trauma guys with whom I've worked as a fellow investigator think I'm just a lab doc who's never taken care of anybody sick. And the vascular surgeons all think that I'm just an operating vascular surgeon, never done any research. And I think the transplanters figure I died 25 years ago. So that it's not a good thing to do. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody.
Did you think back to, or were you influenced at that time by what had happened at MCV and with Dr. Hume and transplantation, and were you that involved with immunology at that time?
Oh yeah, that's what my research was down at MCV.
Right.
It all had to do with transplant immunology.
So you never really forgot about working in that area?
No, I certainly didn't, because really the same cellular immune functions that we study in transplantation are, those same techniques are applicable to a lot of different fields, and the one I chose was, it seemed to me, to be one that most surgeons ought to be interested in, which is injury, since we both treat it and cause it. So so I decided that would be where we'd take that technology and move along with it.
John, I just want you to know the most enjoyable time I have is working with you together in the Life Foundation.
Well, me too, Jimmy.
And you have done a lot. The Liebig Foundation, tell us how that started with Liebig.
I was a retired president of the SVS, and ISCVS, I guess, was the last presidency I held. And they, I think, were casting about at the joint council meeting for something to give the retired presidents to do, so they gave me the job of heading the Lifeline Foundation, which had been, you know, under the aegis of other past presidents before me. The only thing they did when I got to be president is they took away the funding. They were giving the Lifeline $50,000 a year from the SVS, which they took away, and the ISCVS was going to give us 2 more years, if I recall correctly, and we didn't have any money. So Jimmy and I and Alec Clues, who was the secretary, I guess, at that time, or treasurer, or whatever he was.
Treasurer.
Treasurer. You were secretary, I guess, Jimmy. So we wondered what we were going to do, and you know, one of the first things we thought we'd do is try to hit up some people we knew in the field who had some money, and we went to see Tom Fogarty and got a little money from him, which was a start. But then, you know, we talked and talked, and Jimmy was the one, I think, who really originally came up with the idea, why don't we try to see what the NIH would do about partnering with us in research training. There was the K08 Award, which is a research mentoring grant, which had been present for a long time at the NIH. But we thought that it might be a good idea to go to the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute and see whether they would agree to partner with us in training some vascular surgeons in this K08 format. And the idea would be to leverage their money, because we would try to get an outside donor of some sort to bankroll our share of this, but we'd double the stipend, because it was so low at that point that no young vascular surgeon could afford to buy groceries on the stipend that would be paid to him for doing some research and basic work in the vascular field. So Jimmy knew somebody there on the staff of the NHLBI and was able to set up an appointment for us to see Claude L'Enfant, who was the director at that time. So we walked in there, and he gave us a very cold reception. You know, he said, "Well, gentlemen," said, "I don't know what I could do for you. I don't believe anyone in your field has a grant from this institute." I think he'd looked up my grants, and they were all from the General Medical Sciences Institute. And Jimmy he was now on some private funding in his lab, but he'd totally forgotten to look up Alec Clues. And Alec piped up and said, "Well, Dr. L'Enfant," he said, "I happen to have 3 R01s from your institute, and one of them is a merit award." So things got a lot warmer after that. And we came away with a deal that if we could come up with the money for our end of this collaborative venture, that he would allow us to sit in on the awarding of the KO8s to vascular surgeons so we could screen them along with the other people in the institute and have some participation in this process and see if we couldn't develop some vascular surgery KO8 awards. So I think that that worked out. The reason it worked out was I went down to see Bill von Liebig, who was ill at that time, and I had no idea whether we were going to get anywhere or not, but I went down to say hello and see what I could do, because I think most of us knew him pretty well by that time, and I'd had a number of personal conversations with him before that. So I went down, and he met with his board, which was just a few factotums that he controlled completely, and they said they couldn't reach a decision about our request, so he dismissed them. He said, "Why don't you stay a while?" And I said, "Sure, Bill, I'm happy to." And what he wanted to talk about was airplanes. He'd been a bomber pilot in World War II, and he had his 25 combat missions over Germany, and he wanted to talk about that. I think he knew I'd done a little flying at the end of the Korean War, so we talked about airplanes for about 40 minutes, never mentioned research, and he then said he'd instruct one of his associates to get in touch with me about how we might work this out. And after a lot of negotiation, Jimmy sat in on and Alex sat in on, we finally got a memorandum of understanding about this. So then we breathed an enormous sigh of relief because we actually had some money. Before that, we were promising the NIH to go in with them, but we didn't have a red cent to our name to do this with. But we got some money, and by the time we all left the Lifeline, we had a commitment in writing for 12 million more in funding from them, but that all died. I can't tell you why that died, but Jimmy may know. I don't.
But that was
Nobody
giant
will
practice.
know.
I mean, that was giant progress.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's
Yeah,
a
but
lot of
it
money.
all went down the drain, as far as I know.
Well, the second thing that John did was Fogarty. We are not supposed to to name that, but you are the one that really.
Yeah, well, I
Fix
said,
it.
"Tom, you know, vascular surgery has been very good to you. It's payback." And he said, "Yeah, I guess you're right." No, he gave us $1 million, which was
Wow.
was
It's
was
a
good.
matching grant.
Yeah.
Remember, he
Yeah.
gave 1 million first, and then we've raised 1 million. He would
would
give
give
another
another.
million.
Yeah.
So that's altogether $3 million.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
That's good work,
And
John.
John, there's still one more good work. That is Julie Jacobson.
Oh yeah. Well, you
You-
know, Julie again had been very well rewarded by our field, and I chatted with him if he wouldn't like to bankroll our conference
Yeah.
every year down at the NIH, and he agreed. He and his wife. So we did get from no money to at least some money for the
Wow.
Lifeline.
And it's all John's effort. The leadership did it.
Well, we all three played a lot of role in that. It was a pretty good triumvirate. We're all very different, but it worked out fine.
Last question is
Yeah.
related to artery. I'm very interested in your article on the bypass to the isolated popliteal artery. How you come up with that?
Well, I think if I can, I may not be correct in my memory, but I think the reason was that it was clear that while we had started early on back in 1961 doing some tibial vessel vein grafts, they as a group didn't do as well as femoral popliteal bypasses as far as long-term patency were concerned. We got an awful lot better when we used loops and, at least in our department, used in situ vein grafting, which I think is, if done the way the Albany group did it, probably gets less damage to the vein, and that it's got nothing in it but heparinized blood, which I think veins like a lot better than all the other stuff we've put in them over the years. So I think that tibial vessel grafts became very much more feasible, shall we say. But in that time, it seemed as if maybe since you could see a popliteal artery on an arteriogram filling and emptying, maybe the idea would be to raise the head of pressure in the popliteal so that you might very well get some increase in collateral flow distally. So we started doing a few of those, and indeed we saved some feet, and we began to publicize it a little bit, and we put some flow meters on those grafts, and they had respectable flows in them. Some of it probably went back up the leg, but some of it clearly went down the leg. So we did save some feet, rather spectacular salvages with them. I don't know now whether that would be anything that you would do preferentially. I think you'd probably take an in situ graft down as low as you could get it these days, wouldn't you, if you were going to reconstruct some of these diabetics?
You may have done the first anterior tibial bypass with a vein.
I think also the first perineal, if you want to know for sure,
How did you decide to go ahead with that?
because that was all that was left.
Yeah. I see the obvious thing.
So, you know, Andy Dale reported several posterior tibial vein grafts to the vascular meetings in 1962, and we'd been doing them for a year, and we thought we were really pioneers, but discovered Andy had beat us to a presentation. We presented our work in '63 with all three vessels bypassed, and I think there was also another person whose name was De Palma, not Ralph, but an Argentinian, who claimed he'd done a posterior tibial bypass, but looking at the angio, it's clear that he sewed it into the distal popliteal below a very anomalously high takeoff of the anterior tibial. So it was basically the distal popliteal. And then there had been somebody who's named McCann, who had published in a regional medical society journal a bunch of Dacron grafts to tibial vessels without much follow-up. But he perhaps is the first to have done it, though I don't know, what happened to him or whether you count that. But I think that's the history, like all histories, is cloudier than it looks to the public. I think we may have been the first to do anterior and perineal artery bypasses. But that was all St. Philip.
And MCV.
Yeah, MCV.
Did you use some of Dr. Linton's ideas with the vein grafts?
Indeed, I was totally influenced by Linton as to how to do vein grafts, because when I was a resident and worked with him, his would work, and the younger, quote-unquote, vascular surgeons all failed. So it seemed logical to do whatever the old man did, and I paid a lot of attention to what he did, and I was fortunate enough to have 6 months of my residency at 2 different 3-month tours as the resident on his service. So I got to operate with him quite a lot, and I really appreciated it. And I was really pleased when we presented this work with the distal bypasses to the SVS in 1963, he was in the front row, and he came up to me and put his arm around my shoulder, and he said, "John, that's a good start."
Let's talk about your family.
Yeah.
John, we talked about the fact that you and Virginia got married when you were in medical school. Now you have 3 daughters.
3 daughters. Well, the eldest one is a lawyer, and I think venture capitalist is the best way to put it. And she has been in the financial world, particularly firms behind the former Iron Curtain.
Oh.
So investments there had been her forte. And our other 2 daughters are doctors. One of them gastroenterologist and one an infectious disease specialist. And the infectious disease gal works in Boston, works for Novartis. They have a think tank in Cambridge run by Mark Fishman, who used to be head of cardiology at the MGH and a number of other bright lights. And they plan product development there and plan new ventures. So she likes that a lot. The other one was the unfortunate gal who was caught in Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and she and her husband bailed out, went to Maui, where she practices gastroenterology. She may be the only doc in town because she's horrendously busy, but I think enjoys it. So she left academia totally. She goes over to the University of Hawaii once in a while to help out a little bit with pediatric GI. But so she decided to do both. She got herself qualified to do both, and so she's now a from cradle to grave GI person.
And John, plus 7 grandchildren.
Absolutely.
So I'd have to say, just from that record alone, your career has been very successful.
Yeah. Well, we think so.
John, let's talk for a minute about your honors and awards. Needless to say, starting with 5.8 from Harvard, you were SVS president in 1981.
I think 1980, wasn't it?
Was it 1980? I had
Yeah, I think so.
1981.
I think it was 79. You know, president-elect, and president 80 to 81. Yeah, you're right, 80 to 81.
Then I, as CVS president, 1990 through 1991,
Yeah.
one of the few people who were president of both of those vascular societies. President of the Lifeline Foundation, 1996. A startling honor. You were a member of the editorial board of New England Journal of Medicine, which I'd have to say is a unique situation for a vascular surgeon. You were on the editorial board of JVS and the British Journal of Vascular Surgery. Distinguished Service Award for the American Association of Vascular Surgery. Society of University Surgeons Lifetime Achievement Award.
That was a very nice thing. They decided to do that for some old goats that hung around the meeting beyond their years, and I was very pleased to be the first that they picked for that. I think maybe it says something about our surgical politics in that the first 5 awardees of that award had no office in the Society of University Surgeons. So we had never been politically successful in that organization.
But John, you really received huge recognition for being hugely effective. This long list goes on and on and on. Looking back, why did this happen to you? Why were you so different?
I have no idea, to tell you the truth. I always felt that I was doing a job I liked and trying to do it the best I could, and I guess you just have to take what comes. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But I think if you do research, you understand in the long run that it goes according to the Peter Pan principle. A lot more ideas peter out than pan out, you know. And a few of them do pan out, and that's why you get honors.
Well, with this long list of awards and honors, clearly you had a handle on time management. Do you have any tips?
Well, I think I learned a lot about time management from Dick Egdahl, who was the most successful time manager I ever saw. And that he just felt that in order to do academic surgery, you had to be a good surgeon, you had to spend time with your patients, you had to teach residents and students, but you also had to make time to do research, and you just had to be ruthlessly efficient
Right.
with your time in order to do this. And he was awfully good at this, and I tried to follow his lead.
You know, John was the president of American Surgical. And then later on, Andy Whittemore.
Yeah, I had two
president.
trainees that became president of the American. One of them Andy, and the other was Tim Eberlein.
Yeah,
Amazing.
it's amazing.
So
To have
I
this
was,
kind of legacy.
well, I think that was a really nice thing.
According to some of your colleagues, John, you are also credited with having a photographic mind. Do you think there's any truth in that?
Well, I don't know. I think I have a reasonably good memory, and I'm waiting for it to disappear. Now that I'm 85, but
Now I'd like to talk about some specific areas in your career,
sure.
these focus areas. The first having to do with distal bypass. Some believe that you did put long leg bypass on the table, which we've already talked about. Talk for a moment, if you would, John, about your Scotland adventure with Larry Ollier.
Oh my! I was probably to my sorrow talked into joining up with a project the dean had at Harvard Medical School after I had retired from being chief, and it seemed like a reasonably interesting job. It was called Harvard Medical International. And the idea was to go around to various places in the world and see if you could sell some Harvard academic services here, there, and everywhere. And one of the places they were interested in was a new venture in Scotland to build a private hospital. Why Scotland, I have no idea, but that was where the venture was. And the chief operating officer of the Brigham was persuaded to quit and run this show, get the hospital built, and see if they couldn't make a go of it. So the dean was interested, and he figured that Harvard Medical International ought to have some role in there, and I was kind of the point person and for the Harvard Medical International and consultant to the outfit. And part of my job was see if I could persuade some decent surgeons to come work there. And the first one that I felt I was able to persuade was Larry Ollier, who I always thought was absolutely superb as a surgeon and as an organizer and as nearly anything else you want to mention. So he went there, they paid him an obscene amount of money, and then we hired some other staff, some him, some me. And unfortunately, the whole thing failed miserably because of internecine warfare on the board, and that some of the sources of patients, for example, Middle East and Southern Europe, totally dried up from the machinations of some of the board members, and they were left with this gorgeous hospital with nobody in it.
Do you think that this was a premature idea, John? Do you think?
Well, I think perhaps the idea of running private hospitals in Britain was not new,
Right.
but this was done pretty much without a whole lot of input from the locals. Now, the academics locally in Glasgow were nominally on board with this, but they really didn't like it very much. And the British docs down south of the border hated it because, you know, it was perhaps endangering some of the private practice in London, and also certainly the National Health Service hated it.
Yeah.
So I think it may have been ill-conceived. I don't know. I don't know that I had much to do about either the planning or the abandoning of it, but I was around watching both happen. But that was an absolute fiasco.
John, I'd like for you to reflect for a moment on the evolution of vascular surgery. You were close to the ground floor when things really started happening in vascular surgery, not only with distal bypass, but with aneurysm, resection, extra-anatomic bypass, and so forth. How do you look back on that evolution?
Well, I think you've described it. My career was almost exactly coincident with the beginning of vascular surgery and its evolution through the time I retired. Because the first real arterial reconstructions at the MGH were done my intern year, some by Stan Crawford. And by the time I got back from the Korean War, why, that was in full flower. And then there was this terrible realization that homographs deteriorated, so all those needed to be taken out and redone, and they were redone with fabric grafts, which didn't work very well. And then off in the corner was Robert Linton putting in vein grafts like Kuhnlein had written up and succeeding brilliantly. And, you know, he really did transform reconstruction below the inguinal ligament, I think, with that publication of a very sizable series, some more than 200, as I recall, vein grafts to the popliteal artery with patency rates that were just absolutely astonishing.
Spectacular.
73% 5 years, as I recall.
Spectacular.
Spectacular. So I thought that, I think that having grown up with that, it certainly made an impression on me. And as I said, when I got out of residency, I was fortunate to have worked with Linton for a while, and I knew how he did it. So we went down and started doing it. You were around, I guess, Roger. And
I was changing dressing.
it worked pretty well.
Sure did.
Yeah.
To speak for a moment, John, about endovascular surgery, I've asked this question to a number of people we've interviewed, and no one will give me the answer I'm looking for, the truth. How can this work? This is irrational, John. How can this work?
Well, I'm not so sure that some of it works very well. Some of it perhaps does, but I got to say that my interpretation of Basel was that it showed that doing something funny to the arteries first gave you a lot fewer opportunities to do something good later. And I still think that is something to think about. Now, I'm not saying that I'm condemning all of this, but I got to say that I think I enjoyed operating on vascular disease. I don't think I would enjoy pushing catheters in vascular disease because we did that. And when I was at MCV, we used to have to go down in the afternoon to the X-ray department where we had a fluoroscope and a pressure injector and some Seldinger catheters and try to do our own retrograde angiography. I thought that was the biggest pain in the neck I ever had. And why did anybody want to do that voluntarily? I have no idea. I was so delighted when the radiologist took that off our hands at about midterm in my time at BU. I had never wanted to go back and do any of that again.
You must concede, though, that some of these endovascular
sure.
PTA, stents, and so forth,
Yeah.
but how can that work? I know it does. How can that work?
Well, I suppose the answer is that if you get over about 6 months of reaction to the injury and you still have a patent vessel, the reaction is quieted down by then. And if it was a big enough vessel and you're lucky, it'll probably work for quite a while. But it takes about 6 months for the cellular insult to subside.
Let's talk for a moment about the whole host of mentors that you had, John. We talked about some of these at lunch today, but could you talk for a moment about some of your mentors, Dr. Hume, Dr. Linton,
Well,
Crawford?
I'd say from vascular surgery, of course, Dr. Linton was a great mentor, but I learned an awful lot about operating from Stan Crawford, and I used to go down when I was at MCV quite frequently, fly over to Houston and see what Stan was up to, and also watch Dr. DeBakey quietly from the rear of the gallery and see what they were doing. So I learned a lot about aortic surgery from them. I think Dr. Linton could do aortic surgery, but I never really thought the way he did it was anything I'd care to mimic. It was terribly drawn out and seemingly overly complicated.
What
Whereas
about
DeBakey was very much a systematizer and a simplifier.
what about Dr. Hume?
Dr. Hume was absolutely one of the most brilliant guys I ever saw, and he also had a great deal of hardship being the mature figure that a chief should be. You know, he was something of a wild man, but he was delightful to know. He was a great friend. He'd support you. He was always in your corner. And he had 100 good ideas, or he had 100 ideas every 5 minutes, and at least one of them was usually pretty good. 99 were no good at all, but he was just an amazing man. And I would have said, sure, he was a great help to me, and he gave me my first job, for heaven's sake, and I owe him a lot. I also think I owe my academic career in great respect to Dick Egdahl, who taught me how to do this, which is not too easy, I don't think. And I certainly owe a great deal to Don Thomas, who supported me throughout my career and was a great friend all my life. And it was so delightful when he and Joe Murray, who of course was on our staff at the Brigham, won the Nobel Prize in 1990. That was one great deal as far as I was concerned.
Wow.
One of the things I'll always remember about Joe, and he invited Chitty and me to go to his first press conference after that the Nobel Award was coincident with the American College meeting in San Francisco that year. And so we were invited to go to it, and he got up there and he said, first thing I'd like to say is that none of this would have been possible without animal research, which was one of those periods when it was under great pressure in California, at least. And the San Francisco papers didn't print that, but oddly enough, the Los Angeles Times did. But anyway, Don and Joe were great guys. They show that sometimes nice guys finish first. And I was just thrilled when that happened. Don even showed a picture of me and some of those dogs we talked about in his Nobel lecture, just like Joe showed Roy Kahn and some of those dogs in his.
Let's talk for a moment about your hobbies, tennis and golf.
Well, I can't play tennis anymore, Roger. I can't even walk, as you know, much less run. But I do like
Played very well
golf.
in the past.
I like golf, and was out last weekend. First weekend, yeah. It was great.
Now let me ask you one other thing about a possible hobby. You've been accused of having a secret desire to be a fighter pilot. Is this true?
Well, I guess I could say that I got to exercise it a little when I was in the Korean War, since I got to fly fighter trainers as my hobby in that time, and I suppose I got rid of some of the desire just by doing it for a while. But you know, cruising at 500 miles an hour keeps your attention.
It really does.
Yeah.
Now, in everyone's life, it's not a succession of successes. We all have disappointments, being human beings. Have you had disappointments, John?
Of course. Now you're going to ask me what they are.
No, not necessarily. I would ask, though, what did you learn from disappointment?
Well, I think I learned that you probably will find something in what has failed that you could use to do something else. And I think if you can do that, it's a lot easier psychologically. It's like when a line of experimentation totally blows up, there's often some hint about something that you could do next in all of this. And even though it peters out, it may pan out next
later.
time around. Yeah.
Now, I'd like to ask you a series of strictly opinions.
Sure.
The first is that, needless to say, over the last few years, the American healthcare system has become a political football.
Oh boy.
And do you think we've lost our way, John? And do you think that the Massachusetts way is the best model?
I do not. No, I think that if you just look at what the costs are,
Yeah.
you know, we have the highest costs for health care in the nation, as far as I know.
Can we do better?
Well, I would say that, I think we clearly were doing better before that thing was put on us. And okay, maybe a few more people are covered, but not many. There are still people who aren't covered, because you can't get all human beings to sign up for anything.
Right.
And, if you put them all in jail if they don't, maybe you would. But, we still got a bunch of uncovered patients in Massachusetts, and we're spending ourselves into the drink. It really, I think, has been a disaster, frankly.
The merger of SVS and ISCVS, do you think this was a good idea, or do you think that that's harmed international exchange?
Frankly, I thought it was a great idea. I sort of hated this kind of there's them and us part of the meeting, and I loved it that everybody's a member, and okay, you can call SVS members distinguished if you want to, and I think we'll probably stop that one of these days and just go about our business.
What do you see as the role on the international stage for SVS?
I would have thought it's the premier vascular surgical organization in the world, and I always thought so, and I still do.
One question that one of your colleagues asked me to ask you, but I think he knew the answer, but I don't. How did you get to be a complete Anglophile?
I didn't know I was.
Now,
I guess I have some friends in England, but I mean, most of us do, I think, don't we? But then we got them in France and Italy and Germany and...
well, you don't even speak with a Boston accent, John.
No, I think I speak with the accent I grew up with, which turned out, to the great good fortune of people who grew up in the West Coast in my era, to be TV accent.
Right.
Because it came right out of TV studios in California, so that the American accent is the one I grew up with. So I didn't have to change anything.
If you had to give advice to young vascular surgeons coming along now, what would you say?
Be sure to learn how to do some things that are not endovascular. Let's be sure you actually can fix an aneurysm. Be sure you can actually put in a vein bypass. Be sure you can actually take care of problems at the base of the neck. In other words, and I certainly think you ought to be darn sure you can do a slick, quick carotid endarterectomy.
Absolutely.
So I think that's what I would do. I'd emphasize not the fashionable, but the unfashionable open surgery and training. And if you don't get that, I think you're going to suffer.
And the question is, how do we teach them how to do that
Right.
in the time when there aren't very many of those cases anymore?
I would guess that you'd probably have to have an awful big program to keep that going. We used to try to keep vascular fellowship down to the point that we were running them ragged so that they got a lot of things to do, and they would thank you at the end of the year, though they'd want to kill you in the middle of it. I just have a feeling it takes an awful lot of cases to train a vascular surgeon now, more than it used to, would be my answer to that.
Jimmy?
Well, John, thanks for coming.
Well,
It's
my
been
pleasure.
a great pleasure to see you again.
Glad to see all of you guys and enjoyed it.
Thank you for this interview, John.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.